They brought her to me as the last clause of a treaty, and I did not go down to the gate to meet her. That was the mood I was in. I sat in my council hall at Goldhillow with the peace scroll on the table in front of me, still smelling of the wax it had been sealed with 3 days gone, and I let my steward tell me twice that the Queen of the Kell had crossed the river and was riding up through the amber grass to my hold before I so much as lifted my head. A king rides down to meet a queen. I knew that. I did not do it. I was a war king at the raw end of 11 years of war, and the woman coming up my road was the price of stopping it, and I could not make myself feel anything about her but the dull resentment of a man paying a debt he'd rather have fought over. Understand the shape of it. The Kellar were a smaller folk than mine river people, Marsh-Endreed people who had held the far bank of the Sunder against my grandfather and my father and then against me, 11 years longer than they had any right to. They were beaten now. Not crushed, I want to be honest about that. I never crushed them, though my war master begged me to, but beaten, worn down to bone and grief, their villages thin, their young men fewer every spring. And they had a queen, a reigning queen in her own right, no man's regent, who had finally sent envoys across the water to say, "Enough, let us make a peace." And my council, weary as I was of burying my own, had made a peace and sealed it, as such peaces are always sealed, with a marriage, her hand, mine. The 2 banks of the Sunder, bound in one bed, so that neither could raise a spear against the other again. I had agreed to it the way you agree to have a bad tooth drawn. I had never wanted a mate. Some men are made for it. The bond finds them young and they are grateful. I was made for the field. I'd have gone to my pyre a lone wolf and called it a life well enough spent, and instead I was to be married inside the fortnight to a stranger from the far bank, a political bride I would neither choose nor want, handed to me folded up inside a scroll like a term of surrender. So no, I did not go down to the gate. I heard the horns instead, from up in the hall, the thin, bright welcome call, and under it the strange lower note the Kell blow, that I had only ever heard across a battlefield, and it raised the hair on my arms to hear it inside my own walls sounding for peace instead of blood. And I heard the yard fill, hooves and voices, and I sat with my hands flat on the treaty, and I made myself into the coldest, hardest, most correct version of a king that I could manage, because I had decided that if I was to be sold into a marriage, I would at least not be seen to feel a single thing about it. They came up into the hall. My steward and my war master Garrick with his jaw set the way it had been set ever since the peace was signed, and then a knot of Kell in their river greys, travel-stained, dignified, and in the midst of them, a woman with a plain gray traveling veil down over her face. I stood, correctness required that I stand. I did not smile. "Queen of the Kell," I said, "be welcome in the amber reach." And she put back her veil. I have gone over that moment more times than I can count in all the seasons since, trying to find honest words for it, and the honest words are these. The whole loud hall went quiet, and it did not go quiet for anyone but me. The horns, the voices, the shift of feet on stone, all of it dropped away as if I'd gone under the surface of the river, and in that great sudden silence there was only her face, unveiled, turned up to mine. She was not what I had braced for. I had braced for cold, a hard, beaten, calculating woman come to sell herself for her people and hate me for buying. What looked back at me was a queen, yes, unmistakably, in the set of her shoulders and the level dark eyes, and the way she wore her weariness like a robe rather than a wound, but a queen who was warm. That is the word, and I cannot better it. There was warmth in her face the way there is warmth in a banked hearth you come to out of the cold, something that had been kept alive through 11 bad years by main strength and would not be let go out. She looked at me, at the war king of the Amber Reach, whose name her mothers had frightened children with, and she was not afraid, and she was not cold, and something behind the level dark of her eyes was even, God help us both, a little kind. And the hard old wolf in me lay down. I need you to understand what that was, because it was the thing I could not forgive for a long time after. My wolf was a war wolf. It had run down men on the field. It had never in its life bared its throat to anyone, never lain belly up, never softened for mate or mother or king. It was the meanest, coldest part of me, and it had kept me alive through 11 years. And the instant that woman put back her gray veil in my hall, it lay down in the dust of me and showed her its belly like a fool pup that had never known a hard hour. It knew her. It knew her before I did. It lay down and it said in the wordless way of the old blood, there she is. It's her. It was always going to be her. And I stood in front of my whole court with my face, a king's cold, correct mask. And inside I was a man whose own wolf had just betrayed him utterly to a stranger from the far bank of a river I'd bled 11 years to hold. "War King," she said. Her voice was low and unhurried, and it went through me like warm water. "I'm told your people call the Sunder a border. My people have always called it a road. I'd like, if we can manage it, to make it a road again." It was a good thing to say. It was a queen's thing to say, gracious and shrewd at once, and my whole hall felt it land. And I who had 100 correct things to say back, I who had planned to be ice, I could not for a moment find a single word, because my wolf was lying in the dust of me with its throat bare, and I was busy hating it. "We'll see," I said, coldly, which was churlish and beneath me, and I saw one of her river-gray folk stiffen at it. She did not stiffen. She looked at me a moment longer, and something moved at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile, but was kin to one, as if she'd expected me to be difficult, and was almost relieved to find she'd guessed right, as if a difficult war king was at least an honest one. "We will," Bronwyn agreed. "See, that's all I've come to ask of anyone. Thank you for the welcome." And she inclined her head to me, a queen to a king exact, not a hair too low, and let my steward lead her and her people away to the guest wing. And I stood in my hall with the horns starting up again and the world coming back from underwater, and I thought, with the flat certainty of a man watching a bridge he's standing on catch fire, this is a catastrophe. I told no one. Who would I have told? That the marriage I'd agreed to as a cold clause of a colder treaty had turned out to be, of all the disasters, real. That the woman handed to me by scroll was the one my blood had been waiting a lifetime for, and I had felt it the instant her veil lifted, and it was already too late to unfeel it. I'd have sooner cut out my own tongue. Garrick would have looked at me the way he looked at a flank that had gone soft. My council would have thought me bewitched. The Kell were marsh folk, and there were old, ugly stories about marsh witchery, and I'd not hand my council that kind of rot to chew. So I did the only thing a hard man knows to do with a feeling he can't afford. I walled it off, and I watched her from behind the wall. And in the days that followed, the alliance days, we called them, the fortnight of treating and guesting before the wedding that would seal it all, I watched Bronwyn of the Kell be a queen, and it was the undoing of me, slow and complete. I watched her with her own people first. They had come thin and worn, her river-gray folk, and there was a grief in them under the dignity, the grief of a beaten people who have agreed to a peace that costs them their queen. And she carried it. That's what I saw. She did not pretend it away, did not chatter brightly over it. She sat with her people in the evenings in the guest wing, and I passed the door once and heard her, not commanding, not consoling, just listening, low and steady, to an old Kell woman who was weeping about a son 11 years in the river mud. And Bronwyn held the woman's hands and let her weep, and did not once look at the door to see who might be watching her be gentle. A queen who is only a queen when she's watched is a coin. A queen who is a queen with no eyes on her is the real thing. I had that from my father, the one good thing he taught me, and I stood outside that door and I knew I was watching the real thing, and I hated how much I wanted to go in. I watched her with mine. My court did not love her at first. How could they? 11 years is a long hate, and there were hard men in my hall who'd lost brothers to the Kell and who looked at their coming queen with stone faces. She did not flatter them. That was the thing that turned them in the end, and it turned me too. She did not once try to charm my hard court out of its grief. she met it. When old Baal, who'd lost 2 sons on the Sunder Fords, would not rise when she entered, and sat there stone-faced and rude before his king, I half rose to have him hauled up, and Bronwyn put out a hand barely and stopped me, and she went to Baal instead, and she said, quietly enough that only those near heard, "You lost sons to my people. I lost a brother to yours, and a husband, and more of my folk than I can hold in my mind at once. I'm not going to ask you to like me, Baal of the Reach. I'm only going to ask you to let me try to make it so no one else at this table loses anyone else. Will you let me try that much?" And old Baal, who had not risen for his own king, looked up at her a long moment and got to his feet. I sat there with my hands flat on the table, the way I always did to keep them still, and I thought, she is better at this than I am. She is better at being a monarch than I have ever been, and she learned it beaten, and she is about to be my wife, and I have been treating her like a term of surrender. That was the first crack in my wall, not the bond, which I could rage against, but the plain fact of her worth, which I could not. The bond I fought. I want to be honest about that too. I fought it like a soldier. Because, and this was the reasoning I built myself a fortress out of, a bond that comes to you inside a treaty is not a free thing, and I was a man who had spent his whole life prizing the few things I'd chosen freely. I had chosen the field. I had chosen my throne, taken it and held it with my own hands. And now here was the deepest choice a wolf can make, the mate choice, and it had been made for me, folded into a scroll, handed across a table by tired diplomats. It felt like the one bargain I'd never agreed to. I told myself, this pull I feel is not love, it's just the blood, it's just the old animal machinery doing what it does, and I'll not be ruled by it. I'll not hand my heart to a woman just because a treaty put her in my hall. I'll keep the peace. I'll keep the marriage, but I will not be undone by it. I'll stay a king and keep my distance and let it be the cold contract it was written to be. I built that fortress high, and Bronwyn, who did not know she was besieging it, took it down stone by stone without ever once lifting her hand, simply by being, day after day, more than the contract had any right to contain. There was an evening, 6 or 7 days in. I'd not been sleeping. The bond does that. It makes you restless in a hold that holds your mate, and I went walking my own walls in the small hours the way I do when I can't lie still, and I found her on the south wall before me, alone, looking out over the amber grass toward the black line of the Sunder and the far bank where her country lay. I should have gone the other way. I went to her. "You're a long way from your own walls, Queen of the Kell," I said. She didn't startle. She'd have made a good soldier, Bronwyn. She was never startled. "So I am," she said. "I keep looking for them out there in the dark. Old habit. 11 years of standing on a wall at night looking for your people across a river." She glanced at me. "You'll know the habit." "I'll know it." We stood a while. The grass moved in the dark, a great slow amber sea of it, and somewhere down in the yards, a wolf of my pack lifted its head and looked up at the wall where she stood, and I felt it recognize her the way my own wolf had, and lie back down content, and I was glad she couldn't see my face. "May I ask you something, War King?" she said, "as one monarch to another, and not as a bride to a groom, because I'm tired tonight of the second one." "Ask." "Do you resent me very much?" She said it plainly, no self-pity in it, a queen taking the measure of a hard fact. "You didn't come to the gate. You said we'll see to me in your hall like a man biting a coin he thinks is false. I've a marriage to walk into in a week, and I'd rather walk into it with my eyes open. Do you resent me? Because if you do, I'd sooner know and manage it than be surprised by it after the vows." And there it was, the plain, honest question, put to me in the dark by a woman with more courage in her than my whole council, and I could have lied. I was good at lying with a cold face. I'd done it my whole reign. But she'd asked me monarch to monarch, and there is a debt in that I couldn't cheat. "No," I said, "not you," a long breath. "I resent that it was decided for me. I've chosen every large thing in my life with my own hands, Queen of the Kell, and this, The largest thing a man like me ever chooses was chosen for me by tired men over a table and handed to me sealed. That's what I resent, not you. And I stopped, because the true end of that sentence was a cliff I was not going to walk off in the dark. I said instead, I've no complaint of it all. You're a better monarch than I am. My hard old court is going soft on you, and I don't blame it. She was quiet a moment. Then, that's the most either of us has said that's true since I crossed the river. Thank you for it. And she looked back out at the dark toward her country. For what it's worth, War King, it was chosen for me too. I didn't want a husband. I had one. The war took him early, and I found I ruled better alone and grieved enough the once. I'd have gone to my pyre a widow queen and called it a life. And instead here I am, handed across a table to the man whose grandfather started the war that made me one. A breath of something that was almost a laugh. So we're two of a kind, you and I, two monarchs who never wanted this, doing it anyway because it's the price of the thing we do want, which is for no one else to die. If that's all we ever agree on, it's not nothing. It's a road, not a border. It's a road, not a border. She kept saying it, and every time she did, another stone came out of my wall. Good night, Queen of the Kell, I said, because if I stood there any longer I was going to say the true end of the sentence. Good night, War King. And then as I turned, Reese. She said my name, my given name that hardly anyone living used. You could call me Bronwyn. We're to be married in a week. It seems a small enough road to start on. Good night, Bronwyn, I said, and my traitor voice went soft on it against my will, and I heard her hear it. And I went down off that wall like a man in retreat. I have to tell you about Garrick now, because a story of a peace is always also a story of the men who don't want one. And mine was Garrick, my war master, who had won me half my battles and who would not, lay down 11 years of war just because two monarchs on a wall had found a road. I'd known Garrick was against the peace. Every hard man in my hall was a little against the peace. That's the nature of hard men and long wars. What I did not know, what I was too busy fighting my own bond to see, was how far against it he'd gone. Garrick's reasoning was simple, and from a certain cold height it was even sound, which is what made it dangerous. The Kell were beaten, he said, low in corners to the men who'd lost brothers, beaten and thin and worn to the bone. Why marry them? Why bind ourselves to a river folk who'd fought us 11 years, take their queen into our king's own bed, make them our kin, when one more hard summer's campaign would finish them, and the Amber Reach could simply have the far bank, all of it, the good riverland my grandfather had wanted, no queen, no treaty, no sharing. A marriage made the Kell our equals forever. A war made them ours. Garrick wanted the war. He had wanted the war his whole life. Peace was a country he had no map for and did not care to visit. And so I pieced this together after, from frightened men who'd half known and said nothing, Garrick set out to make sure the peace failed. Not openly. He was too old a wolf for that. He set out to make it fail at the wedding feast itself, in a way that would look like the Kell's own treachery, so that my whole hall would rise in the old hate, and there'd be no peace to keep and no bride to marry, only the last clean summer of the war he loved. If a few Kell in my hall could be made to seem to draw steel on their host at the feast, if the old woman's grief and the young men's shame could be prodded into one ugly moment with a planted blade and a planted shout, then the treaty was dead. The Kell were oath-breakers in the eyes of the Reach, and Garrick had his war back. I didn't see it. That's the shameful truth at the middle of this. I, who'd read 100 battlefields, could not read my own hall, because my whole attention for that fortnight was bent inward on the fight I was losing against my own heart. I was so busy walling off my bond that I let my war master build a fire under my peace, and I never smelled the smoke. Bronwyn smelled it. She came to me the night before the wedding. Not to my chambers, she was too careful of both our dignities for that, but to the council hall openly, with two of her river-gray folk, and she asked my steward for the War King, and she stood across the treaty table from me where we'd first spoken, and she said, without any softening at all. Reese, someone in your hall means to break the peace at the feast tomorrow, and make it look as though my people did it. I went cold, not the resentful cold I'd worn all fortnight, a soldier's cold, the kind that clears the head. Tell me. She told me. She'd seen it the way a beaten people learn to see things from below, from the corners, from the servants and the grooms who are invisible to hard men and who see everything. One of her folk had been offered coin, quietly, to make a disturbance at the feast and then flee across the river. He'd refused it and come straight to her, shaking. A blade not of Kell make had been seen where a Kell hand might be blamed for it. And the coin and the whisper traced back, her people were sure of it. And so, the moment she said it was I, because it fit him like a glove, to Garrick. I could have said nothing, Bronwyn said, watching my face. That's what you should know before you decide what I am. I could have let it happen. If the peace breaks tomorrow, Reese, it breaks on your war master's treachery in your hall, and the whole world sees the amber reach shatter its own oath. And the Kell, beaten as we are, have every king across the water pledged to come to the aid of a monarch so betrayed. I could have let your man hand me that. I could have walked into that feast, let the blade fall, and walked out the wronged queen of a righteous war with half the world at my back. Her level dark eyes did not waver. I didn't. I came and told you and burned my own advantage to the ground because I did not cross that river to win, War King. I crossed it so no one else would die. I need you to know that's true about me before tomorrow, whatever else you decide I am. I stood there and looked at the woman my blood had chosen. The woman I'd been telling myself for a fortnight I could not freely love because a treaty had handed her to me. And I understood all at once and completely that I had had it exactly backwards. The treaty hadn't robbed me of the choice. The treaty had only put her in my hall. The choice, the real one, the free one, the one no scroll could make for me, was standing in front of me right now, waiting. I could keep my cold contract, marry her tomorrow as a term of surrender, and rule beside a queen I'd walled myself off from out of stubborn pride about how she'd come to me. Or I could tear the wall down with my own 2 hands, the way I'd taken my throne, and choose her freely, as a man chooses a mate, not because a treaty said I must, but because I looked at her burning her own advantage to spare my people, and I wanted it more than I'd wanted anything since the field. There was no bond compelling that. The bond had only shown me the door. Walking through, it was mine to do or not. Bronwyn, I said. My voice was not a king's cold voice now, and I let it not be. Thank you. For the peace and for burning your advantage and for being everything you've turned out to be that no treaty had any right to contain. I came around the table to her. I've been a fool for a fortnight. I told myself I couldn't truly choose you because you were chosen for me. I had it backwards. Let me put it right. Not tomorrow at the feast before everyone, right now here, with only your folk and no crowd to play to, so you know it's true and not for show. I don't want to marry you because a scroll says I must. I want to marry you because I've watched you be the best monarch I've ever stood near, and the warmest and the bravest, and my blood knew you the moment your veil lifted, and I've been fighting it out of pure stubbornness ever since. I'm done fighting it. If you'll have a hard old war king who came to this late and badly, I choose you, treaty or no treaty, for you, not for the land. She was quiet a moment, my queen, and then something came up in her level dark eyes that I'd not seen there before, not the kept warmth she showed the world, but something newer and more uncertain and more her own, the look of a woman who'd braced 11 years for everything except being chosen. You're certain, she said. It's the bond talking, some of it. I'd not hold you to a thing the blood decided. The blood opened the door, I said. I'm walking through it on my own legs. I've chosen every large thing in my life with my own hands, Bronwyn. Let me choose this one too. Let me choose you. And Bronwyn, queen of the Kell, who had crossed a river to give up her freedom for her people and found, on the far bank, a war king willing to give her his heart of his own free will. She put her hand against my chest, over the place where the hard old wolf lay quiet now, and she said, low and steady and warm as a banked hearth. Then we'll choose it together, Reese. Not a treaty, not a surrender, a road. And that not-quite smile came out at last into a whole one, the first I'd seen from her, and it was worth the 11 years. Now, about your war master. We dealt with Garrick together, and that is the part I am proudest of in the whole account, because we did it as two monarchs and not as a wronged king and his rescued bride. I wanted to take him at once, drag him from his bed and put him in the deep cells and be done. Bronwyn stayed my hand. If you take him tonight in the dark, on my word, she said, your hard men will always half wonder whether the Marsh Witch Queen only wanted your war master out of her way. Take him tomorrow, in the light, in front of your whole hall and mine, with the proof laid out so that no man living can say the peace was built on anything but the truth. She was right. She was always right about the shape of a thing. She'd learned governance in a harder school than I had. So we let the wedding feast come. And when the hall was full, my folk on one side and hers on the other, wary still, the old grief thick in the air, and when Garrick sat there smug and waiting for his planted blade and his planted shout to loose the last summer of his war, we did not marry. I stood up first and the hall quieted, and I said, before there are any vows, there's a truth this hall is owed. And then this was Bronwyn's doing, and it was the wisest kingcraft I ever saw. She stood up beside me, and it was she who laid it out, the queen of the beaten kell, calm and merciless and fair, the coin and the whisper and the foreign blade, all of it, with her river-gray man who'd refused the bribe standing forth to tell it in his own voice before both peoples. She did not accuse the amber reach. She was careful, so careful, to name it as one man's treachery and not a people's, to hand my hall its honor back even as she cut the poison out of it. The war king's peace is true, she said to my folk, to her folk, to all of them. One man among you would have broken it and blamed my people to buy himself one more war. He does not speak for the amber reach. I know that, because your king came to my aid the moment I brought him the truth, and a faithless people do not have a faithful king. And she turned and looked at Garrick, and every eye in the hall turned with her. Garrick tried it anyway. Hard men always do. He surged up with the old fury and cried treachery and marsh witchery, tried to loose the very moment he'd built. But there was no planted blade to fall now, no confusion to hide in, only two monarchs standing shoulder to shoulder with the truth laid bare in the light, and his own men looking at him with dawning cold understanding. And when he reached for his own steel, it was Baal, old Baal, who'd lost 2 sons to the kell and had not risen for me but had risen for her. It was Baal who took Garrick's arm and held it and said, in the flat voice of a man choosing peace over the war he'd have been owed, no, Garrick, no more, she's right. I'm tired of burying sons. Let it be a road. Let it be a road, my hardest man saying her words back to her. That was the moment the 11 years truly ended. Not the scroll, not the vows, but old Baal's hand on Garrick's arm and the whole hall exhaling at once. We did not spill Garrick's blood. Bronwyn asked me not to, and she was right. A peace that opens with an execution is a peace with a crack down its middle. We stripped him of his command and put him over the water into a quiet exile, to live out his days in a country with no war in it, which for a man like Garrick was punishment enough and mercy besides. I heard he took up bees in the end. I hope the bees stung him. I've made my peace with hoping only that. And then, with the poison drawn and both peoples watching, and the light of the high summer evening coming gold through the western windows, I did the thing the title of this account has already promised you. I did not marry Bronwyn as a treaty. I took the peace scroll, the actual scroll that had brought her to me, with its clause that bound her hand to mine as a term of the settlement, and I held it up before the whole hall so all of them could see what it was, and I said, this is a treaty. It ended a war, and I'll honor every line of it till I die, but it will not be the reason I marry this woman. I'll not have it said in her hearing or her children's that the queen of the kell was a clause. And I set the scroll down on the table, and I turned to her, and I went down, a war king before his whole hard court and hers. I went down on one knee to Bronwyn of the kell, which no king of the Amber Reach had knelt to anyone in living memory, and I asked her, not as a treaty asks, but as a man asks. Not for the land, Bronwyn, not for the river or the peace or the far bank my grandfather wanted. For you, because I choose you freely, the way I've chosen everything that ever mattered with my own 2 hands and my whole heart and no scrolls leave. Will you have me? And the hall was so quiet I could hear the summer wind in the grass outside. Bronwyn looked down at me a long moment, her war king on his knee, his hard old wolf lying quiet and content in the dust of him at last, no border left in either of us. And the whole warmth she'd kept banked and alive through 11 bad years came up into her face and shone. And she reached down and took my 2 hands in hers and drew me up to my feet, because she'd not let me kneel to her long, then or ever after. I crossed a river to give myself up for my people, Reese, she said, and her low voice carried to every corner of that still hall, and I found on the far bank a man willing to give me his whole heart of his own free will. That's not a treaty, that's not a surrender. The whole smile again, the one worth the 11 years. That's a road, yes. 1,000 times, yes, I'll have you, for you, not for the land. I have been many things in my life, a soldier, a war king, a hard and lonely man who thought he'd go to his pyre a lone wolf. I have never been anything I'm gladder of than the man who stood up off his knee in that gold evening light and was chosen back freely by the warmest queen 2 rivers ever knew. We were wed that night, not as a clause, as a choice, both of us, out loud before both our peoples, so no child of ours would ever have to wonder. And the 2 banks of the Sunder have not raised a spear at one another from that day to this, and the river is a road now, thick with boats and marriages and the ordinary traffic of folk who have forgotten how to hate each other, which is the finest thing a war king can leave behind him. But that's the treaty's tale, and it's not the one I keep for myself. The one I keep is smaller. Every autumn, when the grass goes to amber and the light comes long and gold across the reach, Bronwyn and I ride out together to the south wall where we first spoke honestly in the dark, just the 2 of us, no guard, 2 graying monarchs on tired horses, and we stand where she used to look across the water for her people, and we look now at a river with no border in it, and she says it every year the same, half a jest and half a vow. A road, not a border, war king. And every year I take her hand, this woman my blood knew before I did and my heart chose after freely, with no scrolls leave, and I answer her the only way there's ever been to answer it true. A road, I say, you built it, I only walked across.